Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening.
Hello, and welcome to Mormon Mental Health. This is Jennifer White, and I'm the host for today's podcast. I'm a therapist with my LCSW. I want you to be aware that this podcast will cover some serious issues or mature audience issues, including topics of sexual abuse. So take care of yourself, and this may not be appropriate for children. I'm very excited to interview our guest today, but before we get to that, there's a couple things for me to mention. First, Mormon Mental Health Podcast is sustained only through your donations. Any donation is helpful, and your donations go directly to sustaining this podcast. And you can do this at mormonmentalhealth.org. If you want to support in non-financial ways, there's many ways you can do this. You can like our Facebook page, share links, tell a friend, provide feedback or comments, recommend other topics, come on our podcast. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Jesse Ellis. Jesse is a licensed clinical social worker and currently working as a therapist. He went to BYU for grad school and graduated in 2010. We actually went to grad school together, and before that, worked together at Heritage Treatment Center. Jesse is married and has 5 children. He's a native to Utah County and remains there, so his wife and kids can be close to family. Jesse is a friend to the Mormon and post-Mormon communities and wants to share his experience and expertise with those who might benefit. Hello, Jesse. Welcome to Mormon Mental Health Podcast.
Thanks, Jen. Happy to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your background that you would want us to know about?
Yeah, thanks. Professionally, I've done quite a few things. As you mentioned, we worked a long time ago with youth, but I've been doing this type of stuff for about 20 years, mostly in the legal sector, in our at-risk youth sector, in the health sector, and now working within a psychiatric outpatient clinic as a therapist. So clinically, I've had a lot of involvement with addictions, with substance use disorders, work quite a bit with our LGBTQ, our queer population. Love doing that, and with our individuals that are struggling with faith transitions. With respect to Mormonism, I was raised in Orem and within the covenant. I've done a lot within the church, very familiar with the Orthodox pathways of the church, but also familiar with the less Orthodox pathways of people stepping away from their faith. I try to claim affinity to neither end of those spectrums, but my only hope with all of that is that people find a sense of internal peace and get to be true to their authenticity and their own convictions.
Definitely. Yeah, I enjoy that work as well. And yeah, I mean, in our code of ethics, it's very important that we don't put our own goals on other people. So I like how you were saying, it's not whether they stay or not, but them being true to themselves.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And then did you want to share any more about just your background as a Mormon, or?
I was in seminary council I served a mission in Argentina, Mendoza, Argentina. I did leadership stuff when I was in college with the Institute at Utah Valley University. I was very involved. When I guess we were at BYU, I struggled with my beliefs. I took a sidestep and had to sort through what all of that meant for me.
Which was interesting because you were the president of our class, but certainly it's okay to have issues and go through that.
No, I think I surprised you with a few things a few months ago when we had a conversation, not just about some faith struggles that I've had, but some experiences in my childhood.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
You mean I was good at putting on a face.
But I remember you were the one that introduced me to Mormon stories with John DeLynn. I think that was during grad school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
definitely. That was one of the avenues of support for me.
Yes. Yeah, it's been great. Yeah. Well, and I know that we talked a little bit about this podcast before, but I was going to ask before we get into it, what's influenced you to want to talk about this now?
And I assume you're referring to sexual abuse and not faith struggles, or maybe it's all.
Yeah, the experience that we're going to talk about in a minute.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have been back and forth on whether or not I would ever talk about this for many, many years. It's not something that I feel like affects me on a day-to-day basis. It is something that I feel like was hard and a bit of a challenge, something that I learned things from. And the more that I do the work that I do, which allows me to have an impact in people's lives, but the more I do that, the more I want to feel like something more productive and good has come from all of that.
Yeah.
And I think also the work that I do sheds light on just how common a lot of this is, but how private a lot of it is. And, when these subjects come up, that's usually something that's brushed under the rug, whispered about, right? They're kind of taboo, uncomfortable subjects. And, I think it's important for those who live within this, who this is their own experiences, to have a space to talk about it and make sense of it.
Definitely. Yeah. And I can think it can be very empowering and even therapeutic as long as it's on your own terms.
Yeah.
Like where and when you're talking about it.
And, I guess I wear two hats in this situation. I'm coming from the patient perspective, but having practiced clinically, I have, my own training that helps me make sense of this on a clinical level.
Definitely.
Also, right?
Yeah. And I love it when therapists are willing to open up and share their stories, with their boundaries and with, whatever goes along with that. But yeah, I appreciate it.
We'll see. I'm rolling the dice a bit here. I worried, I think, for a while that this might have an effect on my professional reputation, but I think that, the value in sharing important information, I think, far outweighs whatever negative consequences might come.
And I do think clients are, I don't know, I think to them, it makes us seem more relatable. And that can be a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and go. I know we're just kind of briefly going to go into your experience, but if you want to go ahead and share that.
Yeah. So when I was young, I connected with somebody within the church who had been abused by a number of leaders within the church. He was younger. We were both young. He was about 4 or 5 years older than me. I was 7 or 8.
Okay.
And he just started teaching me different sexual acts. I think much of what had been shown to him. I didn't learn until later that what he had been involved with, the abuse, the molestation, that had actually been reported to members in leadership positions within the church. And I don't know how high up that went. I wasn't privy to looking at any of those records, and quite frankly, I didn't dig. But from what I've been able to make sense of later in life, it was reported to the bishop. I think there were a couple of bishops, because I think this transpired a couple of times.
Okay. By other church members? Did they
Yeah,
do the?
Yeah, it was within kind of the scouting side of things. So it happened on camping trips.
Mm-hmm.
Happened when people were coming home from school, and kids were supposed to be out playing, from what I understood. But it was, go ahead.
Was this dealt? I mean, you probably don't know too many details, but I mean, was this when it was reported to the leaders? Did they contact the police? With it being an adult.
I'm almost certain that they did not, and I feel confident that it wasn't reported, because the similar response they had for those events they took with what happened between us.
Okay.
So
it was the same with 2 kids than it was with an adult and a kid.
Right.
That's
and in fact, those individuals went on to be, scout leaders for me. So it's not like anything necessarily happened to them, at least that I'm aware of. I'm sure there were conversations that took place, behind closed doors, repentance that needed to have happened. But, I don't think any officials were notified. The individual that I was involved with didn't undergo any kind of mental health therapy or treatment, nor did I.
Okay.
It was all handled, from what I know, and I feel pretty confident about this, within the church.
Yeah.
And this would have been this would have been late 80s, early 90s.
Okay, yeah. So it's been a while. I mean, I'm not going to excuse it, but we should. Less knowledge.
Right.
Granted, these things are still happening today, and we know better.
Yeah. I mean, I know there's been a lot of initiatives taken to reinforce reporting standards and to educate religious leaders, bishops, on these subjects.
Yeah.
But I know that there are many religious leaders who feel really conflicted about how to handle these types of cases.
Oh, yeah.
And some of them get caught up in this kind of role, and maybe this is a bit of a stereotype, but one way that I make sense of it is that they get caught up in this judge of Israel role, that these things can be handled with in their office, because we can help people heal and move forward, and if we get it tied up in the legal system, that it can be less productive or something like that. So I hope that they've learned their lesson, and I hope that these, that these types of cases actually do get reported.
Yeah.
But that's actually part of why I'm here. If there is a percentage of the Mormon mental health population that sits in leadership positions within Mormonism, I'd actually love for them to hear what this is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah. So they can learn about it. A lot of them aren't therapists, they're businessmen, but that's important for them to get this training and understanding.
yeah,
And because what they do affects people's lives.
definitely. Yeah, so that all began, and it was off and on for almost 8 years. I think some of the last encounters were when I was 14 or 15. When I was 11, 12, I think it was when I was getting prepared to receive the Aaronic priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was met with all of the preparatory priesthood interviews. And at that point, I was being asked questions about sexual purity.
Mm-hmm.
So in one of those interviews, I had mentioned that I looked at pornography and that I masturbated. I don't know how I talked about that.
Yeah, it's probably hard to remember. Yeah. Well, and I mean,
I doubt I
masturbation
said
is
it.
something developmentally, it's kind of normal to explore with masturbation.
Right, and if I'm thinking back, pornography was largely through magazines and I think videos, right? But it wasn't
We
like
couldn't get it as easy as it is
that
today.
wasn't
Yeah.
just, but that was part of whatever we were involved with.
Okay.
And
With this
that,
other member who was just
right.
repeating behaviors that were done to him. Is that?
Yeah, in fact, did sexual abuse take place? Yes. Molestation, rape. I personally try to stay away from those terms in my own story.
Yes. Yeah.
I think for the individual that I was involved with, I think that was more of his experience.
Definitely.
It's hard for me to think of two young kids in kind of this abuser slash victim role.
Yeah.
On a bigger scale, I guess, he technically was the instigator and the one that brought these, these kind of actions forward and what this was. But I didn't feel like it was aggressive or, I don't know if I would say that I was molested. I think we got caught up in just early childhood sexual exposure
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
experiences.
And this is your story, and so I want to honor the way that you're the
You,
one that gets to tell your own story, not me. Yeah. And in addition, I agree, if it's two children, that's different than an adult and a child.
mhm. And a lot of stuff grows out of some of those behaviors. It went on for longer than it should have, and I think at some point you develop compulsions with what all of that is, and when you don't, when you're not able to get your needs met, I think sometimes it can come across as a bit aggressive, and I think there were some encounters that felt that way. But yeah,
Yeah.
by and large, it wasn't, in my opinion, molestation.
Yeah.
But I think early on, what was shared with my bishop probably it didn't tell the whole story.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would have known how to just on my own be able to articulate everything that was happening.
Oh, yeah. Well, as a, a young teen or a child, that we don't have the language for this.
And again, why it's important not to as a religious leader, try to handle this on your own. The questions of where did all of this start for you, and these are big actions for such a young person to be taking, and what more is going on, what's the extent of this, and where did you learn some of those words, and you know what I mean, to try to better understand, because I think quite quickly I was cast as just another one of however many kids that found some pornography, and struggled with masturbation. I don't know if they saw the whole picture of the the relationship, right?
And I don't want people to feel shame, because I think it's normal to like masturbate and to explore like and be interested in pornography too. But what's really interesting is that the bishop, it seemed like he's taking this very seriously, when maybe it wasn't taken seriously with the adult who did abuse. Like, we're putting everything in the same category.
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to say is the assessment was very shallow,
Yes.
and then decisions were made from there on how to handle it, that made me feel more like the sinner than being implicated in something that we needed help sorting out, that had just kind of come into my life without a lot of my control.
That must have been difficult.
Yeah, and I think that set off a series of bishop interviews and meetings and consequences, and shortly after I started meeting with the bishop, all of this took on a very different emotional tone. Suddenly there was kind of this crash of a realization at that time that what we were actually doing was really bad. And I think civilly and religiously, this is an activity that anybody wants their kids to be doing together, right?
Yeah.
But religiously, it takes on a much higher cloak of kind of shame, and that's how it was met. I feel like it became quite evident really quickly that, or at least the way I was feeling, was that I personally had done something very egregious, and something shifted very deeply emotionally for me. Where suddenly I felt unworthy. So I had to meet with the bishop regularly. There was a continuance of kind of shallow assessments and misunderstandings.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't advance like all the other kids my age within the church. I wasn't passing the sacrament. I wasn't taking the sacrament. One of my good friends always seemed to be called as like the quorum president. He always wanted me as, like his first counselor or something.
Yes.
And I just remember sometimes being quote unquote eligible for that and sometimes not. The wounds that I think I suffered more long term had a lot to do with shame, as opposed to this sexual activity early in my childhood. That sounds clear? Am I making sense there? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, definitely. I mean, the way that things were dealt with was definitely going to increase shame, including sexual shame. And it's interesting to me how, I don't know, sometimes I just, it's hard to understand how certain things are taken so seriously and other things are not taken seriously enough.
Mm.
And so much of that could be avoided with,
Yeah,
getting, referring to therapists and, making sure things, are reported to the police when necessary.
I think if we could have rewinded and, during those first interviews with the bishop, had a conversation that allowed me to normalize
Yeah.
what was going on, for somebody to, maybe put their arm around me and say, um, this doesn't make you unworthy. This doesn't make you broken. Um, that this sadly is something that happens in our communities. It's not something that we want to see happen more, and we want to put a stop to it, but it might confuse you a little bit. But it is something that happens, and you need to know that you're not alone in this, and that you can
Yes.
still move forward and live a very healthy and productive life despite some of these experiences.
Yeah.
And it's funny, when you're living kind of in the ignorance of what that is, you don't feel any of that weight. I mean, certainly I knew that there needed to be privacy around it because, when it was introduced to me, the individual said it was just our secret. And so, of course I knew that, there was something deviant about it. I think my childhood mind thought that it just meant that we had something special.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if I'm not being clear, I think the response that I received was, you are unworthy. This is a big deal, um, and you are broken. Does that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is definitely you were experiencing a lot of sexual shame because of
yeah,
the way this was dealt with. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that persisted for years.
Yeah.
And in many ways,
And
I think reinforced a lot of the, um, kind of negative habits that were developed in what all of this was. Yeah.
and it's interesting like how much sexual shame can really affect like us even after we get married and how like you know the, I don't know, I wish bishops realize like what they're doing in these interviews can hurt marriages in the future without them, and they kind of separate that, not that that happened in your case but in general.
Yeah, no, it took me looking outside of Christianity, to find a healthier space in my mind with my own sexuality,
Yeah.
to find footing with those experiences and not necessarily hold them against me.
Yeah.
Christianity by and large, takes on a very, um, strong offense to sexual impurity.
And not just Christianity. I mean, this is a very American thing.
Mhm.
I mean, we don't do sex ed very well at all. There's only 13 states that require that the information that they teach about sex be medically accurate.
Hmm.
That was very like alarming to me when I found that out recently. So we're really the way that we're just not preparing people, and that alone can actually cause a lot of sexual shame. Um,
Shame, and I think sometimes propagation of behaviors that people don't really know what to do with.
yeah,
Yeah.
not understand. Yeah. I was going to go over a couple like of the ingredients of sexual shame, and
Mhm.
this comes from a definition. We'll probably read it in a minute, but um, sexual silence. So, like not being able to talk about something, or sex in general. That I mean, that really can cause us a lot of shame. Being sexually shamed, absence of accurate sexual knowledge. You know, we live in a state that doesn't do, America in general doesn't do sex ed very well. Utah really has to improve in this area, I think. That's my bias.
I agree.
And then skewed sexual data. You know, a lot of us are taught wrong information from schools, even from churches, from family, from a lot of different sources, probably from our friends. Well, I don't like shaming porn. Porn is not a good sex education at all. A lot of wrong information.
Yeah, it really can set somebody up for some high expectations.
Yeah, and this is just not how it works. It's kind of like when you watch a movie about like someone like the Fast and the Furious, where they're driving like, you know, way
Right,
fast and everything. And but yet we teach kids that that's not realistic. And
right, right.
yeah, but yet I feel like we should teach more about pornography um, instead of being so afraid of it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
There's a lot of restrictions, a lot of kind of like what barriers put in place, but
Yes.
not a lot of conversations with kids about, in my opinion,
Totally.
yeah,
Yeah.
about what this is and how they're thinking about it and what it means to them.
Yeah. Yeah. Porn literature. Oh gosh. No, I'm not gonna be able to pronounce the word. Porn
Literacy.
literacy.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, is very
Mhm.
important to teach. Yeah. Yeah. And
Mhm.
I like I really want parents to create like a safe place for their parents to come for kids to come to them with questions and stuff. Yeah. So I mean this is all a big part of this umbrella of what sexual shame can include, including obviously hurtful sexual experiences. And one of the biggest things is if you add this religious component and people are like teaching you things kind of with using an abuse of power, you know, where God doesn't approve of this, or this is as bad as killing someone when you're a kid, you know, and yeah, I just felt uncomfortable with that. So,
Yeah, I mean, the point about silence that really stands out to me.
yeah.
Um, I was told not to talk to my mom
Oh,
about any of this.
was that hard for you?
Yeah, um, yeah. I mean, what what things did I, what other things did I hide from her? Like if I got made fun of at school, she knew about it. If I fell out of a tree and twisted my ankle, she knew about it.
Yeah.
Just it was weird that something that had such a profound effect on my life wasn't quote unquote supposed to be discussed with her. And
You couldn't share it with your mom. Yeah,
yeah,
that just
there
seems
was a
weird.
decision made to handle it, within the priesthood. I had conversations with my dad, and I have a good relationship with my dad. He's a good man.
Hmm.
He still is a very believing man, and he didn't question that counsel.
Yeah.
So uh, I think the conversations that he and I would have about it had more to do with, is this stuff still going on, as opposed to, are you doing okay? What does all this mean to
Mm,
you? How can I help?
yeah.
And I don't mean to put that on my dad. I think of how he would respond if he heard that. But that's very much the script within church.
It
You know,
is.
it's
It
an
is.
accountability script. We just need to know that it's kind of been stopped.
Yeah. Well, and parents, I mean, a lot of parents don't even have like the sexual good sexual education themselves, or they've never been taught how to teach this.
Yeah, I mean,
So I can
honestly,
see, having some compassion. But today,
right.
like, I know of classes that are like for adults in sexual education, as well as for parents
Mhm.
that they can go to, that are, and some of them are even free.
Mhm.
That's a little more rare, um, but classes that they can go to learn how to teach their kids about sex, how to talk to them about sex in this non-shameful way. Um, yeah, and uh, also as they become teenagers, there's more stuff like that. There's a lot of good research now. And then these are actually some of the groups that I'm going to be starting soon too.
Sure. Well, and I even, I've got my oldest is 10. So in about a year or 2 years, it's possible that, like, I look at him now, and that helps me see what I would have actually been like, right?
Hmm.
But I guess a question in my mind is, where were my parents in some of those interviews?
Yes.
Um, Especially knowing the type of information that we were discussing, right?
Oh,
Okay, so
yeah. Yes. If I was a parent, I would want to be in the room.
yeah, so
If it was okay with my child
yeah,
or
but
someone to be in the room if they
well,
didn't
and,
want
and I
me.
don't think I would have had opposition. I mean, look, I know that we rewrite our histories as we, grow and evolve, but I don't know if I would have had issue with them being there. But
Yeah.
if I were acting as a bishop now, and this type of information came into my office with somebody who was so young, you know, okay, so do I report it? Yes, obviously you
Yes.
report it, but at that time that wasn't a consideration. But the second question should have been, um, should I involve their parents? And the question clearly came up because they decided to involve one of the parents, but not the other. But then
Yeah.
it was only a measure of supervision, not a measure of support. So it's not like my dad was in
Okay.
these interviews helping to make sense of what all of this stuff was with us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does.
So
And I mean, I
yeah,
think about all the legal issues. Yeah. Like if my husband was a bishop, I would be very concerned. Like, I mean, I would be protective of him, of if he was a bishop, like being alone talking about these
yeah, no,
issues.
tough situation to be in, but it's nonetheless important that they, think very specifically about how to manage this professionally.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in a bishop's best interest to have someone else in the room so
Yeah.
that they don't deal with legal problems and also help people more. I mean, that should be the primary, but I'm adding another motivation here.
Right.
So,
So
yeah.
how all of this evolved, Jen? Look, um, I think the shame uh, evolved into depression.
Okay.
Uh,
Yes.
I by by nature, by my personality, I'm more social and extroverted. So I don't know if it's not like I didn't have friends and that I totally disconnected socially, but I was
Yeah.
obviously troubled.
Yeah.
I think at that age I struggled with trust, with deeper versions of connection, with vulnerability.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. So
And
harder to trust people, harder to be vulnerable.
yeah,
Yeah.
I just think you get caught up in a lot of confusing feelings and emotions.
Yeah.
At that age, I started uh, inferring, definitions on my sexual orientation because of the activity,
Oh,
right?
okay. Yeah.
Um,
Which I mean, what's interesting is like experimenting, um, or in other cases where there's abuse, that doesn't affect, research shows that doesn't affect your sexual orientation. It doesn't change what it is. People used to believe it did.
Oh yeah, no, I can see them looking at it much like we did Pavlov's dog and thinking that this conditions, gay tendencies. But at that age, with how people thought about homosexuality, that's something that I think made me very afraid. And, that's not something that I even care about today.
Yeah.
But back then, that was a big issue. Another thing that
I'm
no, go ahead.
sorry
No,
to
please.
interrupt you. I was just thinking how you were saying earlier how you love working with the LGBTQ
Mhm.
plus community, and I'm sure as hard as this experience is, but like just having compassion for that shame people are feeling.
Oh yeah, like meaning the shame that they might feel about being something that people have a hard time with.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And people were labeling, I don't know if people were labeling, but if your bishop was labeling like what your sexuality was, which really only you can know. No one can label that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's another one of those things that I wish somebody would have been there to help me make sense of, right?
Yeah.
Um, Another thing that really stood out to me, and I don't know where I picked this up, if I read it somewhere or I heard it from, a parent or on TV, but this idea that if you've been involved with this type of activity at a young age, that you'll grow up to reoffend. And
When the research clearly shows that the majority of people that experience anything like this do not become abusers.
yeah, but I lived almost with this fear that I would become something that I couldn't control.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, with time, I remember very closely observing like my impulses and my kind of sexual appetite, thinking, is it deviating? Am I quote unquote going to become this monster that I feel like I'm being labeled as within this culture of shame?
Yeah.
And it really would have been nice for somebody to point that type of stuff out. So in other words, if the
Yes.
conversation wouldn't have been so much about how often is this happening, what is the
Mm,
if those questions lead to more information to help the individual walk through the experiences and understand better what they're internalizing, but
yeah.
it just was about supervision, maintenance, and accountability.
Yeah.
It would have been nice for somebody to say, you need to know that this doesn't mean that you're going to grow up and abuse,
Exactly. I
and this doesn't
agree.
mean that if you are gay, if you are bisexual, these experiences don't make you that way.
Yes.
Um, and so if that's something that you're feeling confused about, let's talk about it,
Yeah.
right? And I
I like
think
that.
those are the conversations that are happening in professional spaces with therapists, right?
Yes. Definitely.
So I bottled it. I was I don't know, I was a mess for a number of years. Fortunately, there was somebody in our neighborhood who I think saw that I was a bit troubled and this family kind of took me under their wing. And I started exercising with the dad of the family. He'd take me to the gym early in the morning. And exercise became a space, an avenue where I was able to channel a lot of the frustration about all of this.
Yeah.
And that was my therapy for many years.
And that can be a really healthy coping skill. And we're finding out, our bodies are really, our bodies remember trauma, and that, exercise, yoga, Pilates, dance. There's a lot of different things that can help and be part of the process.
Yeah, and I don't think my body was going to let me get away with just keeping it in a box
Yeah.
with a lid on it. It took a little bit longer for this stuff to finally come out.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
So I had served a mission. I was a bit of a perfectionist. I just remember putting tons of energy into all of these, I don't know, activities that I think would help me feel like I'm better than what I thought I was.
You've always been very successful and really good at everything.
I would argue that much of that probably comes from an inferiority complex.
Yeah. Yeah.
And people that know me would say, that doesn't add up for us. You don't give us the impression that you have insecurities or that there's a lack of confidence. But
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
it's not that I don't know. It's not that I beat myself up over little things, but look, in some of the formative years of my life, for many years, I hated who I was, and it wasn't that I just felt bad, kind of on a within the Mormon belief spectrum. It's not that I just felt bad with who I was here on Earth. I
Mm-hmm.
felt eternally bad for everything that had taken place and felt like I had been tainted in a way that couldn't be repaired. And you get really hung up in all of the nuances associated with Jesus Christ and the atonement. And
Some of the ways it's taught can be a little bit damaging when it comes to let's just say, what am
Sure.
I'm not a fan of the book Miracle of Forgiveness.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's a real heavy hitter, right?
Yeah, not very not very healthy. Not yeah.
Well, I don't know. Like I love the idea of Jesus, and I love the
Oh yeah.
idea that this kind of metaphysical force in the universe that supposedly, made up for our shortcomings.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't tell you how many times I felt like I was on my knees looking for some type of internal peace,
Yeah.
trying to quote unquote apply the atonement and not getting any relief.
Yeah.
So it was like the theory didn't match with what the experience was in real life. And many people in the faith would say that was something that I was, doing to myself, like I wasn't applying the atonement correctly. Like if that was the experience, then it was
Somehow it's your fault and
yeah.
not yeah.
I mean,
I'm not
and
comfortable with that.
taking a few steps back, maybe looking at it from a different perspective, I think much of the pain that I was feeling internally had a lot to do with my religious beliefs.
Yeah, definitely.
So the fact that God viewed what had happened as somehow so shameful and so wrong that
Yeah, if that's your belief, that's gonna
those are the
affect your
things that made me
thoughts, your
feel
daily yeah.
deeply, deeply unworthy, and not just unworthy of God, but just kind of unworthy of making
Yeah.
something of myself. And I
Can,
don't know. Yeah.
yeah. And there's so many other ways of like interpreting doctrine or what the church would call doctrine. That might be healthier, but
Yeah, I don't
sometimes with
know.
teenagers we're not
Like personally, the jury's still out for me and quote unquote this atonement. I think
yeah.
if people have kind of not to say that not to try to categorize trauma or conflict, but in my professional experience, if people have more low grade negative experiences or traumatic experiences, it seems easier to kind of compartmentalize what that was and maybe hand it over to Jesus. You know what I mean? But if you
Yes,
have these
but
really
you don't need,
profound,
I mean, my understanding of what I hope the beliefs are of the LDS Church are that we don't have to repent of trauma, of
right?
abuse, of any of that. You know what I mean? Not that there might be not some comfort that some people can gain through prayer and handing it over to Christ, like you were saying.
Yeah. Oddly, you know, when you said abuse, it did make me think, had the leaders understood that this was a result of adults
Yeah,
abusing a child who then got involved with me, maybe the tone would have been very different, right?
I would hope
It
so.
would have been viewed as an issue of victimization. But that didn't come
Yeah.
out until I was 23, I think,
Wow.
22 or
Yeah.
23.
And can we pause for a minute
Yeah,
before we
yeah,
get to that part?
yeah,
I really think that the whole definition of sexual shame is pretty powerful.
yeah.
Um, and I, I was wondering if you would read that, and then kind of speak to it.
Yes. Okay. Um, so this comes from Dr. Noel Clark. And the quote is, "Sexual shame is a visceral feeling of humiliation and disgust toward one's own body and identity as a sexual being, and a belief of being abnormal, inferior, and unworthy. This feeling can be internalized, but also manifests in interpersonal relationships, having a negative impact on trust, communication, and physical and emotional intimacy. Sexual shame develops across the lifespan in interactions with interpersonal relationships, one's culture and society, and subsequent critical self-appraisal, a continuous feedback loop. There is also a fear and uncertainty related to one's power or right to make decisions, including safety decisions related to sexual encounters, along with an internalized judgment towards one's own sexual desire." Um, I think it's put very eloquently. Um, I think it articulates the spectrum of complications associated with all of
Mm-hmm.
this,
Mm-hmm.
that largely was misunderstood during that period
Yeah.
of my life.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think making sense of my own sexuality and making sense of my own, sex life took quite a bit to sort out
Yeah. Oh, I'm
because
sure.
of all of that. Yeah.
Definitely, definitely. One thing that I think is so interesting, and if there's often we have church leaders, bishops listening to this podcast, I would hope that they would. I just think it's important for them to know that sometimes when we're using all this shame, it can affect people's being afraid to make decisions that in order to protect themselves, these safety decisions.
Yeah.
Like the more sexual shame people feel, the harder it is to do that.
Yeah, I think sometimes there's just a feeling of defeat.
Mm-hmm. Or I'm already not worth anything, so I don't have the right to say no.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, the questions, the perspective, the curriculum is a bit backward.
Yes.
Like if the idea is to uh, help, if the idea is to um, move people toward a space of healing, I think the conversation needs to be redesigned. The interventions need to be redesigned. Yeah,
Yes.
definitely.
I would agree.
So I think it just needs to be less about accountability and quote unquote, worthiness, and more about what do these experiences mean to you,
Mm-hmm.
How are you making sense of that?
Yes. What are the stories we're telling ourselves about it?
Yeah, and let's try to diminish the negative consequences of what this is.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, there's a lot of really great training for therapists. Like I've been like kind of trained in how to help people move past sexual shame. And I think this is just very common in America. Most of us deal with sexual shame to some degree. And I just want people to know that there is like really good treatments for this, and really good models that a lot of us have been trained in.
Yeah, and that they get to be involved in sexual activity in amazing and healthy ways in their life, right?
Yes,
That you get to
totally.
fully embrace that and enjoy it.
Yes, that's important.
Yeah.
Yes. This is why I'm a sex therapist. I love this part of the work.
Yeah.
Everyone can have a great sex life. Yeah.
Important. So I guess what I'd say is I thought that I would just close the lid to this and walk away from it. When I got home from my mission, I started studying. I was just doing my generals, thought I'd go into business. Actually got licensed to be an insurance agent. Ironically,
That I'm
because the
I
bishop.
just I'm just laughing, sorry, because you're such a great therapist and social worker and all this passion.
Well,
Yeah.
you didn't see me selling annuities and life insurance policies, so
Okay.
no, it wasn't my cup of tea. The bishop that had handled all of this, he was an insurance agent, and so when I came home off my mission, I worked in an associated office, and I did not like it. I bounced around a bit trying to find a field of study that I would like, and by happenstance got connected to a foster care agency and worked just kind of part-time to be a mentor to a couple of teenagers in foster care.
Okay.
Then I thought, okay, maybe this is what I want to do. It got me connected to heritage, and so I jumped into the field of behavioral sciences, started studying psychology, anthropology, sociology, social work. And in one of my classes in my undergraduate, it was a group psychotherapy class, and the teacher felt like it would be important if we acted as group members and not studying clinicians. And this is when this stuff came
Sorry,
up
that
for me. No,
was
yeah,
this
go ahead.
UVU
Yeah,
with
yeah,
Dr. White?
yeah, with Dr. Lloyd White. Yeah,
I
yeah,
took the same class. So sorry.
yeah. I have a love-hate relationship with him. Love,
Yes.
love him that
But I love the name. Dr. White sounds good.
it's
Not quite
fitting
there.
with him. But
But yeah.
I actually went to him during his office time and said, I do have things that I could share in group about my life, but I don't want to.
Yeah.
And he just kind of sat back and he's like, He's like, well, I'm not saying that you have to, but the fact that you don't want to maybe says something about why you should share them. And I said, oh, shut up.
Well,
Yeah.
what about exploring that and asking some open-ended questions instead of
No,
telling you?
it was fine. I ended up
Okay.
sharing on an impulse, and then just wigged out that all of this suddenly had come out of me, and people
Yeah.
knew, and so then I just was a mess. I went from being like 4.0 and on top of everything to back in my head and feeling a lot of anxiety and
Yeah.
just feeling like I didn't have control over a lot of stuff. And I'm like, you've got to put me back together. And he recommended at that time a trauma modality that's now become kind of mainstream, EMDR,
Okay,
rapid eye movement
yes.
desensitization.
Yes.
But back then, this was still very much voodoo treatment.
It was. And now we have all this research. But yeah, at the beginning, it was really viewed differently. Yeah.
And there weren't a lot of clinicians, from what I understood, in Utah that had been trained to this.
It is very expensive.
The
But
training
it's great.
specifically,
The
yeah.
training is very expensive for therapists to get, but now
Yeah,
more people.
and for people that don't know, the neuroscience behind this is that trauma might get locked in regions of the brain in dysfunctional ways, and if we can recall some of those experiences, and while we're recalling it, do some right left brain integration exercises, that it settles those memories and those events in less. So he recommended that I do this, but he recommended a provider down in California. And I was working full time. I was a student. The treatment was going to cost $9,000 to $11,000 when all was said and done. And I had heard, when I was in the middle of all of that somebody I had grown up with in my ward was being supported by the church at a residential facility for substance use disorder.
Oh yeah. I mean, sometimes they will pay a lot of money for treatment centers that cost a lot.
And so for me, it was like, well, maybe it's not a lot to ask the church. Like, honestly, uh, there were legal issues that were missed years earlier. It's not like I was chasing a lawsuit,
Yeah.
looking to
Asking for
hold a
help,
bunch
and
of
plus
people. Yeah,
they played a role in it, but you weren't
yeah.
even saying that.
So I scheduled an appointment with the same bishop that I had met with throughout my teenage years about all of this stuff. He had moved into the stake presidency. And so the reason I scheduled it with him was because I wanted to get some clarity on what he understood about everything. Because in my mind, I was sharing the whole story. I was curious if he didn't hear the whole story. And
Yeah.
it was important to have that conversation. It was obvious to me that he had clues that helped him understand that there was more going on, but he didn't necessarily dig into it.
Okay.
But then he felt terrible. Like,
Yeah.
honestly, in that conversation, he ended up bawling his eyes out. Just felt like a horrible injustice had been served, and so he,
Was
as part
that
of it,
helpful, having kind of like not only that conversation, but an apology? Or
it
if it
was.
was apology. I
Yeah,
don't
no, it was that felt healing. What happened a week later felt very destructive.
Okay. Okay.
Um, you know, and when I had gone to talk to him, part of my healing journey at that point was to do a lot of the work that hadn't been done when I was a kid,
Mm-hmm.
which was talk to my mom about it.
Yeah.
So my mom hears about this for the first time when I'm 22 or 23, and she just falls apart.
Yeah.
Suddenly all these struggles that we had when I was younger kind of make sense to her, and then she
Mm-hmm.
feels bad for not knowing and not protecting and not helping, and
Mm-hmm.
you know just so stupid that just was not uh, shared with her years earlier. But anyway,
But
so
it was at one point, which is good.
and she had already had an interview scheduled with the stake president to renew her temple recommend.
Yeah.
And I guess during that interview, all of this stuff came out, and she just sobbed during the interview.
Yeah.
So a week later, when I went to meet with the stake president, which I understood was going to be basically a conversation on, is the church in a position to give me money for me to go do some therapy over this trauma?
Which financially they are.
Yeah, yeah. It was more of a conversation from the stake president's standpoint um, of priesthood holders don't make their mothers cry. That's one thing that stood out to me very loudly. And the
Okay.
second thing that stood out to me very loudly was that I didn't need therapy, that I wasn't applying the atonement.
Okay, so lots of concerns. But first off, women are strong and amazing and can handle stuff. Doesn't mean that they don't
No,
need to
no, you
talk about
can't,
it
Jen.
and
No,
they can't,
I have to
right?
censor all of these things for you. Yeah.
Right? Oh, yeah, I'm sure all my clients censor everything with all the therapy I give.
You're just fragile. Yeah.
But I'm like, oh, like, so part of me is just reacting to that. Like, yeah, I'm like, women can handle things and a mom deserves to know certain things. And it's okay for women to get upset. If a
They
man was
definitely,
upset, it wouldn't have been dealt with like, oh, priesthood holders can't handle it. We need to protect the priesthood,
yeah,
It-
definitely women can handle it, and women should
yes.
be involved. And
Yes.
their unique ways of nurturing and supporting amidst challenges and struggles is what we need, you know.
Yes.
And
Definitely.
my mom needed to cry about it, right?
Of course.
And I needed to cry about it. It wasn't
Yes.
uh, it wasn't that.
Crying
I
isn't
just
a bad thing.
Well, I just remember going into his office and his opening statement being, priesthood holders don't make their moms cry. And I was like, come again? Like, I didn't even know that she had been to see him and that transpired. So I sat down and he said, your mom was in here, and it was really off-putting. And look, I was sensitive, I was struggling at the time, but just not the best opening liner.
No.
And I just said, look, I said, this stuff is complicated. It's not my intent to hurt my mom, but I think that it's important for her to be aware and to be involved.
Yes.
And so then we got into why I was there, and I had kind of prepared almost a proposal for why I felt like this was a good treatment intervention for me to do. And
One other thing, sorry, just to
yeah, no,
pause, just because
yeah,
you made the comment and I want to make sure I addressed it. Also, like, it's like he's saying things that like potentially could be making you feel even worse as someone who has been through trauma in your life. You know what I mean? Like, or if you want to define it as that, or however you want to define it, has been through a hard time.
yeah. I mean, some of the stereotypes is that kids who've been in, like situations of trauma, that they like hold their adult figures accountable for not being protected.
Yeah.
It wasn't. I didn't come out of this feeling like I wasn't protected.
Mm-hmm.
I came out of this feeling like I wasn't understood,
Mm-hmm.
and um, I came out of it feeling like nobody was asking me what would be right for me, and
Yes.
it felt like a lot of other people's needs had to come uh, first over mine. Um, and
Yes.
honestly,
And the leader re-shaming you instead of meeting
yeah.
you where you're
And
at.
and Jen, even though it was a tough experience, in retrospect, I'm very grateful that it happened, because
Yeah.
it was in that moment that I kind of had a stand up for yourself, time for you to take the reins into your own hands. You've been listening to all of these other people tell you how to manage this stuff, your whole life, and it's
Yeah.
not working. Uh, so who knows if EMDR is going to help, but you feel like this is what you need to do. And whether you have their blessing or not, do it.
That's a
So
very healthy reframe.
yeah, so, and I think, you know, uh, after I pitched the idea to him, his immediate response was, Jesus Christ died for us, and you just need to apply the atonement and you'll feel better. And I just said, with all due respect, I said, this goes beyond faith, and this goes beyond, I didn't say it exactly like this, but this goes beyond anybody's ability to apply the atonement. I
Oh,
said,
yeah.
I don't know how to do that. I'm not getting any alleviation from that. I pray and I
Mhm.
pray and I pray and I pray. And quite frankly, I just think it makes it worse. So I appreciate your feedback. I'm kind of getting the impression that no one's going to help me financially with this. I'm just gonna do at this point what I feel like is important for me. He wanted to
Yeah.
pray with me. That's when he kind of pulled it back and told me that he loved me. I said, I don't know you, and that feels weird to me. And that's where I got kind of, frustrated. Just like, I
You're
don't want to
allowed to set those
pray.
boundaries.
I don't want to pray and don't tell me you love me, because
Yes.
none of this feels like love.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
Thank
and I'm
you.
impressed you were able to say, like, because it's kind of intimidating. Oh, yeah, of course we'll pray. Like, but that you were able to stand up for yourself and saying, no, I don't feel comfortable. Yeah.
Oh, I was a little bossy, honestly. Like he was a physician, and I remember saying something like, so before you go into surgery, do you ask your patients to apply the atonement or to pray or something really like
Exactly. I mean, because that's what he's saying
that?
about mental health. Yeah.
So and I get the fact that for some people mental health services isn't as relative, and
Yeah.
but it was all taking a very similar tone, which was um, just kind of calm down, pray about it, stick with the program, and you'll get better. Um, but I went, and it helped,
Yeah.
and I got ahead of this stuff, and I made sense of it in ways that uh, helped me to redefine what all this was as a strength, as opposed to some
Hmm.
tremendous weight or burden, and I feel like that's when
Yeah.
I started thriving,
So the
where,
therapy really worked.
oh yeah, no, it was great. And look, I didn't get it when I was younger, but I got it when I went to school.
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
um, and what I did in therapy for 6 months, honestly did more for me than what I tried to do within the church regarding all of this shame stuff and sex stuff for
Oh, yeah.
10 years.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. And I'm just gonna say, just kind of to the audience, like for everyone, this looks a little bit different.
Hmm.
Um, some people like there's a bunch of different sources that different people like can get. Um, as a therapist, I guess therapy is going to be number one on my list. Some people need medication, but not everyone. Some people religion or spirituality, which are two very different things. One or both might help. I mean, there's a bunch of things that could be in this kind of like box of like a bunch of different resources, but therapy is very important with this.
Yeah, definitely. Again, helping people make sense of how they've internalized all of it.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
Um, so and EMDR I think works for a lot of people. Other people don't find
Yeah.
as much success with that. I think what was most important at that time in my life was standing up for myself and taking more control.
Yeah.
So I think the EMDR was a nice compliment, but I think um, saying to myself, I get to be the one that decides how I heal, and I
Totally.
get to be the one that decides what all of this was.
Hmm. You are the authority over
Yeah,
your own life, and no one else trumps that.
yeah, yeah. And that's maybe the message that I want to share.
Yeah.
Statistically, this type of stuff occurs, and it ranges, right? But 1 in every 6 to 8 individuals has some type of complicated negative sexual encounter
Yes.
in their lifetime, in their childhood, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so I think it's important to open up the dialogue and help people understand how complicated it can be, but
Yeah.
have them maybe gain some insight so that they know a safer and more appropriate way to approach some of this stuff.
Yeah. 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 No, thank you for that. Yeah. And I was gonna ask, what kind of effect has this, and not like just this one thing, but in general, like, has this affected your relationship with the LDS church?
Um, to be, I guess, honest and transparent, after graduate school, I stepped away from believing in the faith.
Mhm.
This was definitely part of it.
Mhm.
For me, there were a few contributing factors. I think complicated experiences with shame and church leadership was one of those. Um, my education uh, highlighted social policy
Oh yeah.
initiatives of the LDS
Yes.
Church that I think I really struggled with. I had a hard time with the position on, um, Prop 8 was
Very
full
difficult.
production when we were in grad school, and that was hard for me. And they were building City Creek, and I just kept struggling with this idea that Jesus would invest money into a mall, and
Mhm.
but I kept it intact. Um, and then for me personally, I had encountered some information about history that kind of broke my shell. Uh,
Yeah.
so do I claim Mormonism? Yes. Do I
Mhm.
claim Orthodoxy? No.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, but we still go here and there. We very much appreciate the cultural experiences.
Yeah.
I love the music within the church. That was always something that I think grounded me. My mom was
Yeah.
the organist, and I just found a lot of healing in some of the hymns, right?
Yes.
So it played a role. Um, it's hard for me on a grander theological scale to make sense of how we personalize Heavenly Father.
Yeah.
So in the church, it's kind of this idea that he knows you, he's right there with you, and then just being so confused that if he was like right here with me, why would all this stuff be happening? Um,
Yeah.
and where's the protection? Maybe that
Oh,
feeling
it's
that
hard.
supposedly people put on their parents or something, maybe I put that on God. um, you know the other idea that was really hard for me was that somehow I chose all of this before I came, because there's a lot of talk about that within the church.
That oh my gosh. And that's what and there are people that might be really helpful for, and I want to
Right,
validate that
right.
for them, but like for a lot of people that is a really hard thing. Like I know when I'm in the middle of going through some really hard stuff, if
Right.
someone says that to me, I'm like it infuriates me. Like
Well, like, how did this go down, right? Like,
I
maybe
chose
there was
that.
this big wall, and there was a bunch of like, struggles on the wall, and maybe I was like late to get to the wall, and so all the other ones were picked. I don't know. Or maybe I was
Doesn't
like,
one that they like chose like their trauma? No.
this one seems interesting. Let's mix it up a bit. I'll take this one. But so that was always hard for me. These stories about little Katie praying because she lost her keys, and Heavenly Father answered her prayer and helped her find them. But then to kind of grow up and have more expansive experiences with the world, and live in a third world country, and maybe
Yeah.
Argentina isn't third world, but there's parts of Argentina that are that way, and kind of think,
Yeah.
how come Katie gets help finding her keys, but we have tribes of people getting genocided and these just deplorable acts, and
It's hard to
so I
make
really,
sense of all that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think, look, with all the confounding information, it just became easier for me to say, I there's it's easier for me to say that I don't know than for me to say that I do know.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
But I also don't. I think there are people in my life that think that my stepping away from the church is primarily driven by these childhood experiences.
Okay.
And while I think they played a significant role, it wasn't what broke my shelf.
Well, yeah, and in my experience, like it's normally not one thing, it's like a lot of things.
Right.
Yeah.
So while it might feel convenient to kind of put it on that, oh, like,
Yeah.
okay, Jesse's finding his way, he had bad things happen to him, so he just has to distance himself. It's much more complicated than that.
Yeah.
I
That makes sense.
yeah, when I believed, what I leaned on was not everybody in the church is perfect, but the church is perfect, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a
Um,
common narrative.
yeah. So, does that answer your question about that?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. And I'm just a big believer in each of us really is uh, we're the ones that will know what's best for us. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And yeah, that might take a lot of work and some therapy and stuff like that. But ultimately, we're the authority. We make the final decision because we're the ones that have to deal with that. As much as sometimes my clients want me to give them the answer,
I know,
I
right?
want them to, and I want to empower them and help them get to that point to make it. Um, and this is something where I really think it's very different for different individuals. Some people staying in the LDS church can be very helpful, and other people it's not the right thing for them. All of our lives are
Mm,
very different, and there's
right.
not one right way that works for everyone.
Yeah, and my belief is what we should be pushing for is internal peace
Yeah.
and a sense of consciousness that aligns with what people believe is right for them.
Oh, yeah.
Like there were many years when I felt at peace with my beliefs within the church, but
Hmm.
there was a period of time when I didn't, and I didn't want to take the church away from other people.
Yeah.
There's a lot kind of on the post-Mormon spectrum who have very strong opinions about certain cultural aspects of the religion, and for me, that feels a bit like the differences between the Republican versus the Democratic Party. And, we can
Yes.
all kind of get in our dogmas and our tribes. And
Yes.
like, I can appreciate a lot of what the church does that's really good in the world. And if people want to be involved in that, more power to them. Right. But I just
I
don't.
I'm guessing that one of the things that helps you come to that belief or kind of that view is your training in therapy and your experience doing
Yeah,
it.
definitely. I mean, the years of studying sociology, and
Yeah.
you kind of see the pathway of formulating beliefs. And but I do feel like what should be afforded to people that struggle with their faith is some measure of acceptance and support,
Yes.
that maybe the pathway isn't for you to come back to belief, but maybe the
Hmm.
pathway is for you to feel supported as you step away from all of this. And I recognize that that's very that's very contradictory to the mission of the church.
But
But
if families are, and if relationships are so important in this religion, kind of come first, I would think that that would be put supporting people and
mhm,
helping our relationships would be more important than trying to force someone to do something.
yeah, if we could all look at each other and say, maybe this is a lot more complicated than we think it is, and we don't all have the answers, and most people are trying to do the best with what they have,
Yes.
and just kind of give people that vote of support and confidence. With
Hmm.
this type of stuff, if I were a bishop, I wouldn't be pushing. I wouldn't be pushing all the corrective action. I wouldn't be pushing. You know, uh, increased praying and reading. What you have to realize is, especially with sexual trauma within the Mormon faith, there's going to
Mm-hmm.
be indirectly and unintentionally a high degree of shame associated with that.
If
And so,
someone's dealing with a lot of anxiety, telling them that they need to do more isn't very helpful.
well, you want to reduce shame, right?
Yes.
Shame perpetuates all of those cycles that drive
Mm-hmm.
some of those compulsions. And so if the idea is to help them reduce the compulsions, and return back to kind of a state of being more in control with their sexual appetite, whatever that is, then we need to reduce shame.
Yes.
And for some people, that may be allowing them to distance themselves from some of these practices for a while.
Oh, definitely.
And
Yeah.
maybe that seems too radical, but for a bishop to say, "Do you feel comfortable coming to church? Where do you feel comfortable?
Yeah. Yeah.
What's something that we can do to make this easier for you?"
And I do know stories like where I have friends that are therapists that have, with the consent of the client,
Mm-hmm.
communicated with the bishop and kind of helped them understand, with everything they're going through, they need a break.
Mm-hmm.
It'll probably be good for them not to be in church for a year.
Right.
And that's kind of the way that it's been framed and accepted by bishops.
Hmm.
So,
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Uh, I don't think that's the end of the world. And
No.
personally, I don't think it's the end of the world if somebody stops believing. It doesn't mean that they give
No.
up all their beliefs all the time in divinity and
Of
whatnot.
course.
But yeah.
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 Yeah, definitely. Definitely agree. What, and some of this you probably have touched on, but what advice would you give to those that are facing similar situations?
For the people,
Yes.
yeah. Well, let me just say that it can get better.
Yeah.
Uh, it very much can get better, and uh, we hear a lot about the times that this doesn't work out for people. We hear a lot of
Mm-hmm.
sad stories with abuse. We don't hear a lot of success stories, but with the statistics being what they are, I just know that there's a lot of success stories.
Yeah.
Um, and with support and proper treatment, you can live a very full and happy and productive life. And I like to say, like, I kind of like this idea that this stuff doesn't define you,
Oh,
but
yeah.
I don't think that's true. I think what we're trying to say in that statement is this stuff doesn't have to like tie you down, and
Yeah.
the dysfunction that's associated with it doesn't have to kind of perpetuate in your life. But
Or be
I
the main thing
right,
about you. Like, even
right,
when I'm working with people who have just gotten like a charge, whether it's in domestic violence or substance abuse, and they're feeling so much shame and feeling like it's, you know, it just kind of defines them and they can't move forward. Like I'm big on letting them know, like, this mistake that you made on this one day does not define you.
right,
Like, there's so much more to who you are. So,
right. And so many great qualities in you. I would emphasize that. I would um, I would promote uh, doing the work to understand what all of this is to you. So
yes.
many people want to just kind of push it down. Unfortunately, I've just learned that you really can't run from trauma.
No.
You know,
Your body really remembers all of it.
yeah, whether that's because of my own personal experiences or my professional experiences.
Yeah.
And you're hopefully going to feel a greater sense of relief if you put the investment into it. What a lot of people do is when they start to kind of open up that lid of that box is retract and pull away because, stuff comes out that they don't feel comfortable with. And
It's scary. It's hard work.
you got to kind of see it through. And, there is light at the end of that tunnel. And your recovery is you are worth it, right?
Yes.
And I would say that it's better managed, in my opinion, with some type of therapeutic complement to what you're doing religiously. So if you're choosing to try to manage all of this within your faith, you might find benefit seeking some professional assistance.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And that has even been very supported by a lot of the statements from the current brethren, like the 12 apostles.
Yeah, I applaud a lot of the changes that they have made.
Yeah.
And there's been some brave voices of opposition that I think have
very much helped
motivated some positive changes.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. And you have said some stuff already, like what that would be helpful for LDS leaders. Anything else you wanted to add to that?
Yeah. What's just sitting in the back of my mind is this thought that if we push it under the rug, we reinforce behaviors and beliefs, and we model a response protocol that should not be perpetuated by the individual. So it is important to allow for what all of this is to come out. It's important for you as a religious leader not to be afraid of what that is.
Yeah.
Or for family members. It can be heavy and it can be scary, but your response can have a pretty significant impact on how they internalize it.
Yeah.
So I think, being a message of hope, and I think I've said this, but helping them know that this doesn't mean, even if the issue is pornography and masturbation, that these behaviors don't mean that they are broken and unworthy. Right?
No. And as someone being trained in ASECT, becoming a certified sex therapist, I definitely have a very different view on those things than I did when I was in grad school.
Right. That's a sign of sexuality, and that's a sign of our biology. And it's important to help people understand a healthy relationship and balance to all of that.
Yeah, because like the more shame and the more that we talk about it in such like a shameful way, the more the behavior. So even if the goal is to like not do those behaviors, the way we're dealing with it is increasing that behavior.
Yeah, we do a lot.
We see that in stats, like even.
Well, what we say and what is felt are two very different things oftentimes. In other words, love the sinner, hate the sin.
Yeah.
The sinner doesn't always feel loved.
No.
What they feel is the embodiment of hate that's applied to the actions that they feel like they represent.
It really does. And for a long time, I didn't understand that because I kind of believed that, but it really, now I see how it comes across.
And people in the church, especially in in leadership positions, I think need to go out of their way of emphasizing love and support, and not acting as the authority.
Yeah.
I think we did research on this subject.
We did
in grad school, but I think sometimes religious leaders get caught up in this kind of, I have been endowed with religious powers that allow me to fix all of these things. And I try to be very respectful of that feeling, right? Because I think many bishops are on the back end just trying to receive, revelation for their community and know how to best help, the members of their community.
Mm-hmm.
But without offending, I think sometimes it can kind of go to their head a bit, and it
Yeah.
can prevent them from seeking alternative avenues of support. So that's not everybody's situation. There's many bishops who see it as out of their wheelhouse of interventions, and definitely make referrals to the appropriate professionals.
Mm-hmm.
But these issues, in my opinion, definitely need to be managed by people that are trained to help people work through them.
Yeah.
And what I would say to all of the people listening, if none of that speaks to you, um, you know, if we don't talk about it, if we don't create a space for people to be heard and
Yes.
supported, then what the indirect message is what they are, not what they experience, but what they are, doesn't matter. So
Yes. Yeah. In fact,
yeah.
I think it's important just for me to share. Like I do, one of the big research projects I did, one of the things I learned um, through reading like a lot of literature was that the number, like one of the biggest factors, and this is for any religion, of whether people stay or leave it, is
Mhm.
whether or not they have a safe place to talk about their concerns
Mm,
and their
mhm,
doubts.
mhm.
And so, if people are listening to this that are very faithful and want people to stay, that is something that is backed out by research.
Yeah, it's important.
Everyone needs a safe place.
Yeah. So, and I think that's why I've decided to come here. I think I'm choosing to be a bit brave,
Yeah.
um, because I think it's important for people who maybe are in it to know that you can live a very healthy and productive life if you don't think you can, and to
Yes.
maybe hear one person's journey through it and get some ideas of maybe how to help yourself.
Definitely. Yeah, I think it brings a lot of hope. Yeah. I did, and this is kind of me going a little bit back in the conversation, but I did think it would be important just to share. This is something I share a lot, but it's the World Health Organization has kind of a definition of sexual health. Although I want everyone to feel empowered to like kind of figure this out, what's that's and be able to define that for themselves.
Hmm.
Um, but this definitely has some good points that might be helpful for people to see. And a lot of this takes time to work at, and we're not there right away. But yeah,
Right.
yeah, I'll go ahead and read that. Um, Sexual health is a state of physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being related to sexuality. It's not merely the absence of disease, dysfunction. Sexual health is a positive, respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships, as well as the possibility of having pleasure and safe sexual experiences, free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. For sexual health to be obtained and maintained, the sexual rights of all persons must be respected, protected, and fulfilled. And I think about this even in an LDS context of how important it is that like spouses are really respecting, the other person, and of course there's this great place for desire, but there's also this place for things to be safe, and making sure that there's a balance between those things. Often in marriage, there is violence or coercion. But this is kind of a higher level of, okay, it's more to like whether, it's not just the law of chastity, but there's so much more, that for us to really have healthy sexual lives, like that kind of this goes over.
Mm.
Yeah, it's not just not having a disease, there's just so much more to the health.
Mhm.
But what are your thoughts when you hear that definition? Because some of it might seem, I don't know.
Well, what I would say is, for most people, sex is and will be part of their life. And for us to kind of control a lot of that, to make it our business to define what's appropriate and not appropriate, interferes with people's identities in complicated ways.
Yeah.
And I think if we look at it as an important need, and we look at it as a personal journey, one that we can support and respect, then I think we create an environment for people to, live their best sexuality.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, I like that.
and yeah, I just think within religion, sex has such a strong connotation, and what comes of that can be uplifting for some people, but can be very detrimental to other people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like we want to just make these statements of. I think about this idea that we support homosexuality, for example, but we fail to support the lifestyle around homosexuality, and we say things like,
Or
well,
even calling it a lifestyle.
sure, yeah, because
I mean,
it's like, yeah, you
how
know what I
different
mean.
is it really? I know what you meant, but yeah.
And it gets compared to other crosses that people might carry, like alcoholism, for example, and
Yeah.
people who become dependent on alcohol, if they're going to be healthy and worthy, they need to live in abstinence. They need to be sober. So you can tell the community that you're gay, but you don't get to live gay. And it's the same as abstaining from alcohol. Well, I know that people who live in recovery would say that that's not an easy journey, but there's something very different about abstaining from.
We are sexual beings.
Right.
That is part of who we are. You know what I mean? Like, and to completely abstain from sex, which is part of just really an important part of who we are. That's a
Yeah,
personal decision.
yeah, and if people don't maybe have a sense of that, I'd honestly invite them to talk with people within the LGBTQ community who are believing, and you'll hear the pain in the experience and in the narrative, you know, um, and so that maybe is just an example of kind of how I think about why human sexuality should be supported, and that we need to be mindful of how religious beliefs can reinforce healthy habits for people that want to live by certain habits, but really create some strong negative consequences on the opposite end. And I can see somebody raising, maybe the point that we don't. So you're saying that we need to have a more open landscape, for example, right? But we don't allow for rape and these kind of deviant sexual practices. I tend to lean on civil law as a better benchmark.
Yeah.
For how we need to draw a line.
I'm a big, I just really think consent is important.
Right.
Yeah.
But if maybe this is getting too weird, but say somebody comes to the table and they're like, well, I'm a pedophile, and that's the sexuality that I want to experience, and everybody should love and accept that. And sometimes the argument,
consent is not part of that.
Right. Like we as a society has, we've decided there's harm associated with that. I think what's
Yes.
hard within the Mormon faith is against the family proclamation, there's this strong belief that, homosexuality messes with procreative powers and that indirectly creates harm. But I don't see it
Yeah.
as similar to the former argument.
Yeah, well, and kind of what comes up for me with that is like, oh, so the purpose of being married
Just to
is
have
to have
babies.
kids. I mean,
Get
how
off
many
that.
of us deal with
Yeah.
infertility?
Right.
Do
Get
we
off that.
matter?
Yeah. Nope. And you shouldn't have sex either.
Oh,
Yeah, I mean, there's layers to this, right? Uh,
yeah.
I think there's a space to say to somebody, there, even within our history, that marrying somebody who's only 14, that we thought that was appropriate at one period of
Yeah. And
time.
that's not appropriate.
Yeah, I think we can all say, children, and maybe this is how we'll bring this kind of back to the point, but that sexuality matters. It can really get messed up in childhood, and somebody should have said to me when I was younger, we don't want you to feel bad about having a sexual lifestyle. We want you to embrace what that is, but we want you to explore all of that in adulthood when you get
Yes.
opportunity to, fully develop and have the intellectual and emotional maturity to manage the complications associated with that, and potentially the implications that might arise if you make a baby and all of it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
There's a better way of I think helping and supporting sexuality than through initiatives of shame and
Definitely.
abstinence. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, the more education we have about what's going on with our bodies, the better decisions we make. The more
Mhm.
education we have about sexuality, I mean, we have good research to show people make better decisions. Um, as you know, as far as waiting later and into adulthood. And so, I mean, I just think it's really important to empower our kids and to let them know, like, because it's confusing. And, like, of course, we're going to be curious and not understand what's going on with our bodies if no one teaches us. Like, it's a big thing.
Yeah. Yeah. But sexual shame can really mess that up for people.
It can. It definitely can.
Yeah. So I guess we
Yes.
can all maybe walk away from this conversation thinking about how we can uh, do less shaming around all of that and more support.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. I love that. Yeah. That's really good. Yeah. In the future, I really want to interview you about Clergy Bridge since we were both a part of
Mm.
that.
Yeah.
Do you want to give a little teaser about what Clergy Bridge is, just because it is kind of related to this?
I would love to. We had to do a community project in graduate school for a social policy class. As a cohort, we decided to create a training curriculum for religious leaders on difficult subjects, things that come up in their work with members that they feel uncomfortable managing. And it wasn't just primarily for the Mormon faith. We interviewed religious leaders of all faiths, and some of the subjects had to do with cutting. There was a lot about just money management stuff, but
Mental
divorce
health,
and eating disorders and mental health stuff and
domestic
suicide prevention,
violence.
domestic violence. And the cohort, put together a guide. It wasn't teaching them how to do the interventions per se, but it was giving them a lot of, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was trying to push for there to be a chapter
Uh-huh.
about rape in there.
Uh-huh.
And that was kind of, it was interesting because people weren't comfortable going there.
Yeah. And again, it kind of sheds light on maybe how we tiptoe around certain subjects and how certain classes of people kind of get left out of the equation because just they're uncomfortable subjects. Well, and I think we learned that Mormonism isn't the only faith in our Utah County culture, and that not all faiths are producing curriculum like the Bishop's Handbook, for example, that gives a lot of guidance for some of this stuff. But I think we added a little bit more meat, and we responded to what the religious leaders were saying are their concerns.
Making a whole manual free, doing these conferences yearly for about 3 years.
It went on for a little bit, right? I think it helped quite a few people. So we learned a lot, and there's probably a lot to share there. And we could pull out the old manual and.
Oh yeah, I have mine actually. Well, I keep it in my therapy office.
Sure, it's great. Yeah.
So.
Be happy to come on and talk about that.
Yeah. All right. That'll be great. Thank you. If people want to find you or have any questions or want to see you for therapy, what's the way that they can get a hold of you?
I practice through Utah Valley Psychiatry and Counseling Services. It's with Intermountain Healthcare. So it's at Utah Valley Hospital and American Fork Hospital in their outpatient building. The office number is 801-357-7525. People are welcome to call. I can be found pretty easily on Facebook. If people just search my name, Jesse Ellis, Utah. There are a lot of Jesse Ellis's on Facebook, but not a lot of Jesse Ellis's in Utah. And just look for the profile that has a bunch of kids.
Yes.
You're welcome to send me a private message or, hit me up at the clinic if you have any questions.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jesse, for joining me today. I really appreciate you opening up and with how vulnerable you've been willing to be. I think this is so important that more people talk out about this stuff, and that because the silence kind of puts more shame on it. So I just really appreciate that, you telling your story. And definitely I'm going to have you back for more topics. So
well, thank you. And thanks for giving me a forum to share all of this. So appreciate it.
Of course. Yes. All right. And then everyone, thank you for joining us today at Mormon Mental Health.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Unknown ways before me roll. Hiding rock and treacherous show. Chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Boisterous wave, obey thy will, when thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea, Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest, then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say to me, fear not,